Hello, YouTube friends. Welcome, everyone. Before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Chapter 1. The girl of kilometer 237. Many roads cross Mexico. Long, winding, lonely roads. But there are some that traileros avoid naming out loud. Not for fear of sounding superstitious, but because they know that sometimes, in the middle of the night, certain stories come to life if mentioned too confidently. Pedro Alvarez had been driving trailers for almost 2 decades. He started young, accompanying his father on local routes in the north of the country. Over time, he learned to read the winds, to interpret the sounds of the engine, and to be wary of stops that were too lonely. He had never been a man of fears, until one early morning in March, when his life changed on Highway 54D near milepost 237. It was a wet night. It had rained earlier in the day, and the fog was crawling like a wounded animal on the pavement. Pedro had left Zacatecas for Saltillo, transporting heavy machinery. With a radio broken and his cell phone without a signal for hours, the only sound was the steady engine of the Kenworth and the faint pattering of the drizzle on the windshield. It was 2:36 a.m. when Pedro saw something that made him gasp. On the side of the road, just where the fog was getting thicker, a small, almost translucent figure seemed to be walking barefoot in the darkness. A little girl. Her hair was long and soaked, and she wore a white nightgown that blended into the mist. Pedro braked abruptly, without knowing why. His heart was pounding like never before. It was not logical for a girl to be alone on that stretch of road at that hour. He stayed inside the cabin, watching. The figure did not move. It seemed frozen. He grabbed a flashlight and climbed down, the trailer's headlights illuminating the road. The air was icy. He approached, saying in a firm voice, "Are you all right? What are you doing here?" The girl did not answer. She only raised her head. Her eyes were sunken, huge, as if she hadn't slept for days. And then she smiled, a faint smile, too still. Pedro took a step back. Something inside him was screaming at him to go back to the trailer, but he felt this visceral need to make sure she wasn't a lost child. He took another step, and the flashlight flickered. A crunching sound was heard behind him. He turned sharply, and there was nothing. When she looked back to the front, the girl was gone. Pedro swallowed hard. He got into the trailer and accelerated, trying to convince himself that it was a hallucination caused by fatigue. He did not sleep for the rest of the trip. The days passed. Pedro said nothing to anyone, but something disturbed him. A constant feeling that he was being watched. Even at home, he felt the presence. In his dreams, the girl appeared, standing at the side of the bed, smiling. One night, he decided to investigate. He searched in trail riders' forums, in Facebook groups, and there he found several similar stories. The girl of kilometer 237. Some said it was the ghost of a miner run over by a drunk driver in the 90s. Others spoke of rituals performed near that area by unknown sects, and a few, the quieter ones, claimed to have seen her and felt that a part of them no longer belonged to them. Peter felt a shiver run down his spine. The coincidences were too many. The descriptions, exact. Someone even uploaded a fuzzy photo, a childlike figure in the mist, eyes glowing like wet coals. That night, Pedro dreamed he was driving through an endless tunnel. At the end of the tunnel was her, arms outstretched. The most disturbing thing was not seeing her there, but what she said in a voice that was not human. "Thank you for stopping. Now I can come in." Pedro woke up, drenched in sweat. He went to the bathroom, and when he turned on the light in the mirror, he saw it clearly. A small wet footprint, barefoot, on the mosaic. There was no one else in the house. The story spread. Other fellow travelers began to comment that Pedro looked different, quiet, with deep circles under his eyes, as if he was carrying something that could not be seen, until one day he simply disappeared. He had left on a short route to San Luis Potosí and never arrived at his destination. His trailer was found on the side of the same highway, 54D. No signs of accident. The doors were locked from the inside. But the strangest thing was the windshield, full of small handprints, as if a dozen children had touched it from outside, in the middle of the night. Since then, it's been said that if you're driving on 54D at night and you see a girl in the fog near milepost 237, don't brake, don't look, don't breathe hard, because if she sees you, she won't let you go so easy. Chapter 2. The detour that was not on the map. Carlos Rivera was not a superstitious man, far from it. He had been driving cargo trucks all over Mexico since he was 25 years old, and he had seen it all. Deserted roads, fatal accidents, and even confrontations with the police in remote places. But nothing had prepared him for what happened early that morning on Federal Highway 57 near San Luis Potosí. It was the last leg of his journey to Monterrey. He had left Querétaro and only had a few hours left before reaching his destination. He was tired, but his spirits were high, thinking of the good payment he would receive for the load. The weather was clear, the air fresh, and the road empty. In the distance, the outline of the mountains could be seen, dimly illuminated by the moonlight. Carlos didn't know why, but that night everything seemed too quiet. The road was strangely deserted. Not a single vehicle was passing, not even in the early morning, and that made him uneasy. He thought that maybe he was too tired, but when he looked at the GPS on his cell phone, he realized that something was wrong. The route he was following, according to the device, was no longer the same as the one he had planned. The GPS indicated a detour to the right, a small road that was not on the map. Could it be some kind of shortcut, he thought, but decided to follow the directions without thinking too much about it. What he didn't know was that this detour would take him to a place he wouldn't get out of easily. The road became narrower and narrower. The asphalt, once clean and well kept, began to become rough, with potholes and cracks that made it difficult to pass. The lights of their trailer barely illuminated the road, and the fog, which began to form out of nowhere, enveloped everything in a thick layer. Carlos tried to reassure himself. It must be just a construction detour, he told himself. But as he went on, he noticed that the trees around him seemed taller, denser, and the darkness was deeper. Everything seemed strange, as if time had suddenly stopped. It was then that he saw the first lights. They were not the headlights of another vehicle, but faint, almost floating lights, as if someone was holding them up to the trees. Carlos frowned. What the hell were those lights? They weren't headlights or anything he could identify. They were just floating in the fog, suspended without explanation. He decided to speed up a bit, but the lights followed him, not in an obvious way, but enough for him to notice that they were always one step ahead of him, as if they were guiding him. Finally, he arrived at a small village. The houses were old, made of stone, with red tile roofs. Despite the darkness and silence, Carlos could see that most of the houses had lights on, but there was no one outside, not a single person walking the streets. The feeling of discomfort increased, but Carlos, who had always been a man of action, thought he would simply need to ask for the way back to the main road. He parked the trailer next to an old grocery store whose sign was almost faded with the passage of time. He got out and walked to the door. It was heavy, wooden, and when he opened it, a loud creaking sound broke the silence of the night. Inside, there was a woman behind a counter. Her skin was wrinkled as if she had lived many years, but her eyes were clear and penetrating. Carlos, upon seeing her, felt strange, as if his presence in that place was a mistake. He tried to speak, but his words got stuck in his throat. Finally, he managed to ask, "How do I get out of here? I need to get back to Highway 57. The woman stared at him. For a few seconds, she said nothing. Then, in a trembling voice, she replied, "You can't leave, son. No one has left here in years." Carlos didn't understand what she was saying. What did she mean by that? He thought she was joking, or maybe she was speaking figuratively, but the atmosphere of the place made him nervous. He turned to leave, but the woman stopped him. "Your truck is where you shouldn't be. Roads are not always what they seem, and there are doors that should not be opened." Carlos tried to leave the place as quickly as possible, but before he could open the door, a deafening sound from outside stopped him. It was the roar of an engine, a trailer approaching at high speed. He looked out the window. There was nothing there. Terrified, Carlos hurried back to his trailer. As he got in, he saw something in the rearview mirror that made him shudder. The town was disappearing behind the fog, and the road was beginning to twist in a strange way. He wasn't following the road as before. He started to drive back, but could not find the exit. The fog was getting thicker, and on the horizon, he saw shadows moving among the trees, figures that did not belong to this world. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he reached the main road again. But something had changed inside him. The feeling that he had crossed something irreversible stayed with him. He never took that detour again, and although he occasionally passed through the area, he vowed never to stop there again, because he knew that somewhere, in some corner of that place, forgotten by time, there was something waiting. Chapter 3. The Phantom CB Signal. Sergio Sanchez had always been a man of the road. He had traveled thousands of miles over the years, crossing deserts, mountains, and coasts. His truck, a rugged Freightliner 18-wheeler, was his home, his refuge, his life. What he loved most about being a trucker was the company, or rather the lack of it. The solitude of the road allowed him to think, relax, and escape the pressures of the outside world. But that tranquility was interrupted one January night when the CB radio, his faithful traveling companion, began to whisper something strange. It was close to midnight when Sergio crossed one of the less traveled routes between Veracruz and Puebla. The cold was intense, and the mostly empty road stretched endlessly towards the horizon, shrouded in a layer of thick fog. The truck's headlights illuminated with effort, while raindrops hit the windshield. Something was odd, however. The CB radio, normally filled with conversations between other truckers, remained silent. Sergio didn't think much of it at first. The lack of traffic, the rain and fatigue made him more susceptible to restless thoughts. But something inside him, an inexplicable hunch, led him to check the radio. He adjusted the dials and heard the characteristic static that precedes a transmission. Suddenly, a low, barely audible voice was heard. "Sergio, can you hear me?" Sergio frowned. He didn't know that voice. It was soft, but the pronunciation was strange, as if it was distorted, as if it didn't come from a living person. At first he thought it was a joke from another driver, but the name he had mentioned, his name, puzzled him. "Who is it?" he asked, trying to control the discomfort that was beginning to invade him. There was a pause. The static was interrupted by an almost inaudible whisper. "I am here, in the dark. You can't see me, but I can see you. I know what you've done, Sergio." A cold chill ran down Sergio's back. What did he mean by that? What was he talking about? The voice continued. "Remember the place where you lost your way. Remember the detour." Sergio looked around, confused. He had not taken any detour on that route. Everything seemed normal. However, his mind began to recall the conversation he had had in the past with an old colleague, a man from the road who had told him about a strange disappearance near an old tunnel. That story had caused him unease at the time, but he had put it behind him, thinking of it as superstition. "What are you talking about?" he replied, a little upset. "Who are you?" The voice on the radio became clearer, louder. "I've been waiting for you to notice it. The tunnel. You went through it without knowing it. You're trapped." Sergio looked around him. The dense fog that surrounded him seemed to move with the wind, but he could not see anything out of the ordinary. He thought of ignoring it, of moving on, but something stopped him. He looked at the radio once more and repeated, "The tunnel? There are no tunnels here. What are you talking about?" A gust of wind whipped the truck, and the headlights shone in the fog, briefly revealing a figure on the side of the road. Sergio almost fell apart in the seat, staring at the spot where he had seen that shadow. A human figure, a man, or so it seemed, standing at the side of the road. Sergio frowned. He sped up the truck, but the image lingered in his mind. His breathing quickened, and his hand trembled as he held the radio microphone. Suddenly, the voice sounded again, now with palpable intensity. "You're close, Sergio. You've been looking for it all this time. The tunnel. It's more than just a detour. It's a step to another side." Sergio felt the air in the cabin become dense, suffocating. A feeling of claustrophobia invaded him. Something was not right. He looked in the rear-view mirror, and for a brief moment, he could have sworn there was something behind him, a swirling mist that seemed to form a human figure, something impossible, something that could not be explained. Then the voice from the radio burst out loudly, as if it were directly in their ears. "You're lost, Sergio. You can't get out of this place anymore. No one has made it. The tunnel won't let you go." With a jump, Sergio cut the radio and accelerated, desperately seeking to return to the main road. The fog had become even thicker, and the road seemed to twist strangely. For a moment, he thought he was losing his mind. The truck's lights were not helping to dispel the fog. Chapter 1. The Lonely Path. The road seemed endless. In the darkness of the night, Javier could see how the lights of his truck illuminated a straight, almost deserted road that stretched for miles and miles. There was nothing in sight but the distant horizon, crumbling little by little under the dim light of the full moon. Javier was an experienced trail driver, used to spending hours and even days traveling from one end of the country to the other. He had traveled almost every corner of the vast road network, but that night felt different. The air was too cold, and the silence was thick, as if the road itself was holding its breath. The truck roared softly under his hands, and Javier settled back in his seat, looking out the windshield. The sound of the muffled radio surrounded him like a heavy blanket, as if trying to keep the noise of the outside world at bay. In the darkness, he could see how the lights of the truck illuminated the trees in the distance, moving slowly in the wind. Suddenly, something in the distance caught his attention. A pair of flashing lights shone through the darkness, and for a moment, he thought it was a vehicle coming in the opposite direction. But the lights weren't moving like a normal vehicle. They were blinking erratically, as if they were vacillating between presence and absence. Javier frowned and sped up a bit. Maybe they were just other warning lights or a broken signal, he thought. But the nervousness began to grow. He got closer and closer until the distance separating them began to shrink. It was then that he realized that there was no other vehicle on the road. The flickering light did not belong to a car, but to something much more disconcerting. Something was there at the edge of the road, moving slightly. Javier slammed on the brakes, thinking it was some animal, perhaps a deer or some other wild being crossing his path. But as he looked closer, he saw something he couldn't understand. The light was not from an animal or a vehicle. It was more like a figure. He couldn't make out what it was exactly, but the silhouette was human. However, it was too distant to be able to identify it correctly. Javier felt a shiver run down his back, and although his instinct told him that he should speed up and get out of there as quickly as possible, he found himself coming to a complete stop. A whisper of doubt passed through his mind, wondering if he should go closer to investigate. "It's just the darkness playing tricks with my eyes," he muttered to himself, trying to calm down. After all, he was a practical man and had never believed those strange stories people told about disappearances or ghostly figures on lonely roads. However, when he looked again toward the figure, it moved toward him. It did not walk, but seemed to glide slowly without making a sound. The uneasiness in Javier's chest grew, and he could not stop his heart from pounding. He decided not to take any more chances. He stepped on the accelerator, and the truck roared forward, leaving the figure and the flashing light behind. However, what happened next chilled his blood. As he drove away, the figure continued to appear in front of him, as if it had traveled an impossible distance to keep up with him. This is not possible, he thought, and sped up even more. The figure was not disappearing. In fact, it seemed to be getting closer. Javier could feel the cold sweat on his forehead as he looked in the rearview mirror, only to see how the flashing lights continued to follow him relentlessly. Something strange and frightening was happening, but he couldn't explain it. The sound of the radio suddenly came on, cutting through the stillness of the truck. Javier jumped up, looking quickly at the device. The voice that began to speak was distorted, incomprehensible, as if someone was trying to communicate with him from another world. Javier, you are coming towards us. The coldness took hold of his body as he heard his own name pronounced by that voice, which seemed to come from everywhere at once. His pulse quickened, and for a moment, he thought his heart was going to jump out of his chest. Who was that voice? How did it know his name? "Who's there?" cried Javier, but the answer was only a low, empty murmur, as if the very air around him was trying to suffocate him. Without thinking, he made a sharp right turn away from the main road. He knew he couldn't continue on that road, not without knowing what the hell was going on. However, when he looked around again, the lights disappeared, and the silence returned. But something troubled him deeply. Where had that figure gone? And who had spoken on the radio? Javier wasn't sure how much more he could take of that lonely night on the road, but he knew something wasn't right. Something was watching him. Something was waiting for him. Chapter 2. The Night Encounter. The road was still empty and desolate. He saw the warm glow of a gas station. It was a small, isolated establishment, with a couple of neon lights flashing, and the blurry figure of a truck parked at the pump. Javier didn't think twice before making a sharp maneuver toward the place. He needed to rest, clear his mind, and, above all, avoid being consumed by paranoia. As he stopped in front of the pump, he saw that he was not the only one who had sought refuge in that secluded spot. A tall, stocky man was standing next to his truck, smoking a cigarette. His eyes lifted as Javier got out of the vehicle. "Trouble with the road?" the man asked, his voice deep and gravelly. Javier nodded, his mind still troubled by what he had just experienced on the road. "What I saw back there, I don't know what it was. Something weird." The man let out a low chuckle, which echoed in the stillness of the night. "Weird, you say? I see. You met the thing." Javier frowned, not understanding. "The thing?" "Yes, friend. Here, on these roads, there's something wrong. Some call it the Walker. Others just don't mention it. You'd better continue your journey without looking back." Javier couldn't help but feel puzzled. "And you? You don't mind?" The man stubbed out his cigar and took a step toward him. "I'll tell you something, friend. There are no miracles or coincidences here. Everything you see on the road has a purpose, and it ain't yours." The man's words were not what Javier had expected. What did he mean by everything has a purpose? However, before he could inquire further, the sound of another truck's engine interrupted the conversation. A new vehicle was pulling up to the facility, and the man turned around without another word. Javier, although still full of doubts, decided to follow his instinct and approach the new truck. At least he could exchange a few words with another truck driver, someone who might understand what was going on. The driver of this new truck was a younger man with short hair and a tired look. When Javier saw him, he was relieved. Maybe this man could help him understand the strange encounter he had had on the road. He approached and knocked on the door of the truck. "Everything okay?" asked Javier, trying to sound friendly. The young man nodded. "Yes, but I don't want to stay here too long. This place gives me the creeps." Javier frowned. "Why?" "You'll know if you stay any longer." The man rolled down the window and, after a brief silence, added, "That's what happens when you let yourself get carried away in the dark. The road consumes you." Javier felt a shiver run down his spine. The young man's words were not so different from those of the robust man he had just met. Something wasn't right, and although he couldn't say exactly what it was, he felt he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. The young man looked at him for a moment, as if he could read his thoughts. If you keep traveling north, be careful what you encounter. And don't stop in lonely places. There's something on this stretch of road. Something unseen, but following you. Javier didn't know how to respond. The conversation was becoming increasingly surreal, but he decided not to panic. He needed an explanation, something to help him understand what had happened on the road, and this man seemed to have the answer. But before he could ask any more questions, the young driver turned off his truck's engine. "You're going to need more than a couple of tips to escape this," he muttered as he closed the window. Javier didn't understand. Running away from what? What was really happening on those lonely roads? But before he could process it, the young man started his truck and began to drive away in the darkness. The sound of the engine faded quickly, and Javier stood there at the empty gas station with an uneasy feeling that would not leave him alone. He went back inside his truck and started the engine, ready to continue his journey. However, something inside him knew that his fate was already sealed. It wasn't just the tiredness that made him feel so heavy. It was the feeling that there was something following him, something he could never leave behind. Putting the truck in gear, Javier looked once more at the empty road and noticed that the lights of the vehicle that had just left the gas station were no longer visible. But the strangest thing was that in the distance he saw a figure walking along the edge of the road. He wasn't sure if it was real or just a hallucination, but the figure looked familiar. "Who is that person?" he muttered to himself. However, before he could think any more about it, a high-pitched sound started coming from his radio, distorted, as if something was interfering with the signal. The voice on the radio seemed to be calling him again. "Javier, come back." The voice once again sounded clear, but this time the connection was stronger, as if it was coming directly from somewhere nearby, as if the road itself was whispering his name. "Who's there?" he shouted, but received no answer. The voice faded as quickly as it appeared, and all was silent again. Javier, his pulse racing, accelerated even more, not daring to look back. But the feeling that someone or something was watching him persisted. He did not know what was waiting for him on the road, nor if he would make it to the end of his journey. But one thing was certain. Something strange, something dangerous was stalking him, and he could not escape it. Chapter 3. The Presence in the Shadow. The dawn never came. Although the darkness of night seemed to fade in other parts of the world, for Javier, the night seemed to drag on indefinitely. As he drove down the lonely road, he felt as if time had ceased to exist, as if he were trapped in a kind of limbo, where day and night no longer made sense. The sound of the truck's engine was the only thing that broke the silence, but even that seemed distant and muffled, as if it were coming from somewhere else. Javier, with his eyes fixed on the road stretching out before him, began to sense that something was stalking him. Something moving in the shadows, just out of reach. Suddenly a blast of cold air blew through the cab of the truck, chilling his skin. Javier instantly tensed up. Where had that cold wind come from in the middle of the night? He looked away for a moment, towards the side window of the truck, and what he saw froze his blood. In the distance, on the edge of the road, I could see dark figures, human figures, perhaps more than one. They were standing motionless, but their presence was unmistakable. Every time Javier looked towards them, they seemed to be closer, as if they were moving towards him without making a sound, slipping into the shadows. Javier accelerated immediately, but to his horror, when he looked in the rearview mirror, the figures were still there, closer than before. There was no logical explanation for this. There were no back roads where they could have exited. There was no sign that anything or anyone could have approached them that way. Desperate, he looked ahead, searching for some way out, some place he could escape to. But all he saw was more of the same road, endless, like a trap that kept him trapped. He sat upright, breathing deeply to calm himself. But every time he looked ahead again, he felt something invisible watching him, lurking, waiting for the right moment to catch him. At that instant, the truck's radio came on again. But this time it was not a simple interference. The voice that was heard, distorted and shaky, had a tone that Javier had never heard before. Javier, you are close. Closer than you think. Javier's heart pounded, and a cold sweat covered his forehead. What the hell is going on? He thought, his voice trembling as he spoke aloud, as if the words could clear the air. But there was no response. He put the radio on silent, but the sound of the voice echoed in his head, like an endless echo. Who was behind that voice? What did they want from him? In his mind, the young trail driver's words echoed louder than ever. Don't stop in lonely places. But it was too late to repent. He was already too far in. Fate had dragged him into a place he could not escape from so easily. With his pulse racing, he looked again toward the shadows at the edge of the road. But this time there were no figures, nothing, only darkness. Had he imagined all that? Was his mind playing tricks on him out of exhaustion? He tried to convince himself that it was just that, but the fear in his chest would not leave him alone. As he drove on, the feeling of being watched intensified. Javier looked in the rearview mirror once again, but this time, something was there. In the reflection, he could see a shadow following him, and as he accelerated, so did the shadow. Cold sweat began to soak through his shirt. Who was there? He didn't know, but he knew one thing. He was not alone. Suddenly, a loud noise interrupted his thoughts. A thud on the side of the truck made him jump. Javier slammed on the brakes, looking around for the source of the sound. Nothing. There was nothing he could see. But the thump had been real. Something had hit his truck, and it was impossible to ignore. Pure fear began to take hold of him. He decided to get out of the truck, thinking that maybe it was some animal or something he had inadvertently hit. But as he opened the door, the cold air enveloped him again, more intense than before, and a strange silence surrounded him. He walked to the side of the truck, and what he saw paralyzed him. On the ground, right where he had heard the thump, there were deep footprints, as if something large had walked nearby. But there were no traces of anything else. No animals, no traces of vehicles. The Silent Stretch, Chapter 1. Signs in the Mist. Tomas Ramirez was a man of habits. For as long as he could remember, his life had been on wheels. First it was his father's old truck, then a transportation fleet for an appliance company, and later his own red Kenworth trailer, which he christened La Cardenala in honor of his mother. At 56, He already knew the map of northern Mexico like the back of his hand, especially the routes that crossed the mountain ranges of Coahuila and Nuevo Leon. But there was one stretch I avoided whenever I could. Highway 37, between Arteaga and San Antonio de las Alazanas, a narrow stretch of mountain, covered with thick fog almost all year round, and which trail riders called with superstitious respect El Tramo del Silencio, the stretch of silence. It was not marked on any map, but all the drivers knew of its existence. Some said that the radio turned off when crossing a certain kilometer, others that the compasses spun crazily, and the most superstitious claimed to have seen figures in the middle of the road, or lights that made them stop, only to find no one. That night, however, Tomas had no choice. He received an urgent call from the company's coordinator. There was a shipment of medical equipment that had to arrive in Saltillo before dawn. The client would pay triple for the urgency, but the only fast way was precisely that cursed highway. If you leave at 10 o'clock, you arrive just at sunrise, he was told. Avoid stopping. There's no signal, no radio, but you already know the area. It's no big deal, Tomas. Pure superstition. Superstition, Tomas repeated in a low voice as he finished securing the load. I wish it were just that. He left the parking lot at 9:55 p.m. At that hour, the city was already asleep, and the temperature in the mountains was dropping rapidly. He drove through the first few curves, feeling that strange taste for the empty road, the constant roar of the engine, and the tinkling of the instruments on the dashboard. At kilometer 87, the radio signal began to crackle, and shortly after, it was cut off. This was to be expected. I was already entering the Tramo del Silencio. In his logbook, he had noted, crossing start leg, 10:47 p.m. From there, everything became denser. The fog was falling like a wet cotton blanket, and the trailer lights could barely reveal the road a few meters ahead. Despite being used to difficult conditions, that night, something felt different. It was a heavy silence, not only because of the absence of radios or cell phones. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. At kilometer 92, Tomas saw something in the rearview mirror. A long shadow, which seemed to float behind his trailer. He stepped on the accelerator, thinking it was the reflection of the fog or some momentary hallucination. But a few minutes later, something more disturbing happened. On the curve at kilometer 94, right where there is a small rest area for braking trucks, he saw a fire, a campfire, small, right on the side of the road, and next to it, a man. It was not common to see people in that part of the mountain. No one camped there, not without a sign or shelter. Tomas slowed down, hesitating. Could it be a homeless person? Someone with a stranded car? The man raised a hand. He was not signaling. He wasn't asking for help. He was simply waving. And then it happened. The trailer lights went out completely. The engine coughed. The dashboard went black. Tomas cursed, turned the key again and again, but the trailer did not respond. He barely managed to pull over without hitting the stone walls. Clinging to the steering wheel, he turned on his handheld flashlight. The fog was thicker than ever. Nothing could be seen ahead or behind. And the man with the campfire was gone. But the campfire was still burning, with no one around. Taking a deep breath, he climbed down from the cabin. "Come on, man. I'm sure it was a short circuit, or the alternator," he said to calm himself down. He said to calm himself down. Walking around the trailer, checked fuses, nothing. Tapped the battery, nothing. Tried to reset the electrical system, nothing. And then, a thud. It came from the trailer. Someone, or something, had hit the rear hatch of the box. Thomas felt his blood run cold. He pointed the flashlight. He walked backwards, watching his every step. The noise came again, louder this time. It was as if something was scratching inside. Thomas slowly opened the door of the box. It was empty, just as I had left it. But on the floor there was something that wasn't there before. A figure, as if made of charcoal, wet, twisted, a kind of hand-carved cross, stuck to the ground with a black liquid. A foul stench was escaping from her. He slammed the hatch shut again and returned to the cockpit with his heart pounding like a drum. He tried to start up again. This time, the engine responded. The lights came back on, albeit intermittently. He didn't think twice. He accelerated, leaving behind the curve, the fog, the campfire, and everything. For the next 30 minutes, he didn't look in his rear-view mirrors. He did not listen to music. He did not talk to himself. He just drove. At 2:11 a.m., he finally exited Stretch 37 and arrived at a gas station. The night operator recognized him. "Did you come along the stretch of silence, Don Tomas?" Tomas, pale, nodded. "I saw a campfire, and something weird happened. The engine failed, like everything just shut down all at once." The operator looked at him silently. "Did you see her at kilometer 94? "Yes." "Why?" "Others have seen it too. They say it's a trap, that if you stop there, you don't come back. But I stopped. That's why you are here. Those who disappear are the ones who go down to look at the fire." Tomas did not respond. He just looked at the horizon. The fog still haunted him, like a memory that won't go away. Chapter 2. The Echo of the Non-Returners. 3 weeks had passed since that night on Highway 37. Since then, Tomas Ramirez had stopped driving. What he experienced on that stretch was not simply an electrical failure. He knew that. It was something more, something he couldn't explain with logic, mechanics, or common sense. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the silhouette of the man by the campfire, motionless, as if he were not quite human. And in his mind, that thudding sound against the tailgate echoed. It was not the product of fatigue. It was not a dream. There was something else in that place, something ancient, hidden, waiting for someone to cross over unawares. After the incident, the company assigned him vacation time, even though he had not asked for it. "It's for you to rest, Tomas," they told him. "You have years behind the wheel. You deserve it." But the truth was that they no longer trusted him. The GPS report showed an unexplained stop of 47 minutes in the middle of the mountains. The logbook showed inconsistencies. According to his watch, he had been stopped for 15 minutes. But the systems said otherwise, as if time did not run the same there. One afternoon, while drinking coffee in a small local hauler's shop in Ramos Arizpe, he heard something that chilled him. "Did you hear about the abandoned trailer at kilometer 94? Said one of the truck drivers at the next table. They found it 2 days ago. Lights on, engine running hot. But no one inside. Nothing, not a trace." Thomas turned slowly toward them. "What else do they know?" One of the men with a thick beard and black cap looked at him suspiciously, but another, younger, nodded. "It was a colleague of ours, Lefty Herrera. Nice guy, 40 years driving without incident. He was carrying a load of food. He had to deliver in Saltillo, but he disappeared on that stretch. Thomas swallowed saliva. And how did you know it was him? Because of the records, and by the notebook he left open in the cabin. The strangest thing is what he wrote. Just one sentence, scratched so hard that it tore the page. Don't look him in the eye. Thomas clenched his fist. What else did it say? Nothing, that's all. And the worst thing is that he is not the only one. Since January, 4 truck drivers have disappeared on that stretch of road. Always at night, always alone. One of the men gave him a grim look. You went through there too, didn't you? Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, I saw the bonfire. The others were silent. The one in the black cap nodded regretfully. Then you know. It's not a story. It is not a myth. Thomas thought of something. He got up and left without saying goodbye. That night he could not sleep. The hum of the wind against his window sounded the same as the echo of that cursed forest, and in his head the message kept repeating itself. Don't look him in the eye. 2 days later, he received an unexpected call. Ramirez, this is Lefty Herrera's son. I was told you were the last one to cross that stretch before him. Can I see him? They met at an inn in Saltillo. The boy, Julian, was no more than 25 years old. Clear eyes, firm gaze. He had an old notebook in his hand. He offered it to Thomas. It's my dad's. I know something strange happened to him. The police don't want to investigate. They say it's accidents or crime. But it's not that. What did you see that night? Thomas hesitated, but then, as if something inside him needed to come out, he told him everything. From the fog to the figure on the curve, the blackout, the bump in the box, the charcoal figure. Julian listened without interrupting. In the end, he nodded. I want to cross that stretch, too. Are you crazy? I want to know what happened to my dad. I want to take a camera and record everything. Thomas looked at him as if he saw a dead man walking. That place, it changes you. It's not just any stretch. Chapter 1. The Child of the Bridge. The first time Julia heard about Clinton Road was on a rainy early morning during a meeting with her co-workers. They were in the break room of the local radio station, sharing stories to kill the tedium. That's when old Gus, the sound technician, spoke in a muffled voice, almost as if he feared something was listening. Have you heard about the boy on the bridge? He asked, and the room fell silent. Clinton Road, he explained, was a 10-mile stretch of cracked asphalt and sharp curves, flanked by thick woods where sunlight barely touched the ground. They said things happened there that no one could explain. Sightings of shadowy figures, lights with no visible source, satanic rites, and above all, the ghost of a boy who inhabited an old bridge near Dead Man's Curve Lake. If you throw a coin into the creek from that bridge, said Gus, the boy throws it back. It's not a story. I lived it. Julia laughed nervously, not because she didn't believe in the supernatural, but because she was afraid to believe too much. Ever since she was a child, she had felt a special sensitivity to the invisible, vivid dreams, unexplainable shivers, the certainty of not being alone when she was in her room. So that night, Gus's story kept her awake. The idea to visit Clinton Road started as a joke between her and her friend Caleb, a paranormal buff who had a YouTube channel about haunted locations. Caleb was thrilled with the idea. He planned the excursion for a Saturday just after midnight. Darkness, he insisted, was essential, and they would record everything. The drive from Newark was quiet. As they drove, the forest closed in around them like a theater curtain. The GPS blinked and then died, as if the road had absorbed even the satellite signal. Julia felt a knot in her stomach. When they finally reached the bridge, the full moon was reflected in the murky water of the stream. The bridge was old, made of stone and decayed wood. Caleb set up a camera with night vision while Julia looked around, feeling watched. The silence was so thick that even the rustle of a branch in the distance sounded like a gunshot. "Here it is," said Caleb, with a smile. He pulled out a penny and held it over the edge of the bridge. "Let's see if the kid will play with us tonight." The coin fell with a small splash. Julia held her breath. Nothing. The silence persisted, unperturbed. "Maybe it's not today," Caleb muttered, disappointed. But just as they were about to return to the car, they heard a soft sound, like the scraping of something metallic rolling on wood. Julia turned around, and her eyes grew large. A coin was in the center of the bridge, a coin identical to the one Caleb had flipped. "It can't be," he whispered, approaching slowly. The coin vibrated, then it stopped. Julia took a step back, frozen. A small figure, barely visible in the lunar glow, stood on the other side of the bridge. It was the silhouette of a child. His eyes were two dark wells. Caleb raised the camera. The child did not move. "Are you the one who returns the coins?" he asked aloud, with a mixture of mockery and fear. The boy raised an arm. He pointed to it. Julia screamed. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the way the arm was bent, unnatural, or the total absence of expression on that blurry face. She turned to Caleb, but he wasn't recording. His gaze was fixed, completely transfixed. Then the figure disappeared. Julia grabbed Caleb by the arm and they ran to the car. The doors slammed shut, but the engine wouldn't start. They tried several times, sweating, panting, as the silence of the forest turned to muted laughter. Finally, the car started, and they shot out of there. That night, Julia did not sleep, and it wasn't because of the child. It was because of what he found the next day. When they reviewed the recording, they discovered that the video stopped right after the coin toss. Then there was only static. However, in the last few seconds, an image appeared. Julia, standing alone on the bridge, and next to her, a tall, thin, hooded figure they had not seen there. "What's that?" Caleb muttered, pale. "That is not the child," Julia answered, feeling a shiver on the back of her neck. From that day on, strange things began to happen to him. Objects changed places in his house. He heard footsteps in the night. Shadows crossed out of the corner of his eye. Once he found an identical coin on his pillow. And then one morning, upon waking up, she noticed that something had been written on her bathroom mirror with wet fingers. Chapter 2. The Midnight Ranger. Since that night on the bridge, Julia's life became a parade of shadows, whispers, and veiled warnings. The nights were the worst. She slept with the lights on, but the darkness seemed to creep in just the same, as if the electricity couldn't scare away what it had brought with it from Clinton Road. Caleb, for his part, became obsessed. He spent hours reviewing the video over and over again, looking for patterns in the static, analyzing frames, even hiring a technician to try to recover lost footage. But no matter how much effort he put in, the tall figure next to Julia remained barely a distorted silhouette, as if the archive itself was reluctant to reveal its truth. "Julia," he told her one night on the phone, "I've been doing some research. There's more than the boy in the bridge. A lot more. Have you heard about the Ranger?" She felt a shiver. "What Ranger?" They say there's a spirit that patrols that road at night. A guy in an old uniform, like from the 50s. Some people have seen him walking through the woods. Others say he appears if you try to stray from the road. But they all agree on one thing. If you see him, he follows you. Julia swallowed. What are you saying? That there is something beyond the bridge. Something we didn't see. Despite the fear, something in Julia needed answers. She couldn't live with the constant suspicion that something was stalking her. So a week later, she returned with Caleb to Clinton Road. This time, they decided to go further out beyond the bridge, into a deeper, more isolated stretch, where rumor had it that there were remnants of ancient encampments and ritual areas. They entered through an access hidden in the undergrowth, using flashlights and a drone equipped with a thermal camera. It wasn't long before the atmosphere became oppressive. The air was thicker. The sounds of the forest seemed farther away, as if they had been submerged underwater. Halfway there, they found what appeared to be an old, half-ruined cabin. It was small, rotten wood, with a collapsed chimney and what was left of a porch covered with dry leaves. Caleb was excited. He pulled out his camera while Julia stood near the door, feeling that every step was being watched by unseen eyes. Inside the cabin, they discovered a dusty book wrapped in a damp tarp. The pages were filled with notations in black ink. Names, dates, coordinates. Some names were crossed out. Others appeared several times, followed by Latin words. It looks like a record, Caleb muttered. A record of what? Before he could respond, they were both paralyzed by a noise outside the hut. It was not an animal. It was the slow, heavy crunch of boots on leaf litter. A steady rhythm, almost military. Caleb turned off the flashlight. Julia gasped. The sound stopped right in front of the door. Seconds, or maybe minutes, passed. None of them dared to move. Then very slowly, the rusty doorknob turned sideways. A creaking sound announced it. But the door did not open. Only a deep, harsh voice was heard, which seemed to emanate from the forest itself. You should not be here. The door banged loudly, as if something had disappeared on the other side. They ran out the back of the hut, into the woods aimlessly, until they came to an old dirt road. The drone, when it was still operational, began to emit a warning signal. Caleb looked at it with wide eyes. Julia, there is something following us. What? He showed her the screen. A humanoid figure was walking among the trees, with an even pace, always at the same distance. It was not running. It was just walking. But it never stopped. He did not speak again. They on back to the car. When they reached it, panting and covered in scratches, the wheels were covered in mud, and there were boot prints all around. They started as best they could, and did not stop until they reached the city. That night, Julia received a call on her cell phone from an unknown number. She answered with a trembling voice. Hello? On the other side, only silence. Then a faint murmur. You know where I live. He hung up suddenly. She tried to call Caleb, but he didn't answer. She went to his apartment the next morning and found it in disarray, as if someone had packed in a hurry. On his desk was a note. Don't record it. Don't look at it. Don't name it. He never heard from Caleb again. The next few days were worse. Julia began to see the Ranger in places he shouldn't be, reflected in windows, standing across the street. Sometimes, as she closed her eyes, she could hear his footsteps approaching. The worst was the night she dreamed she was walking alone down Clinton Road, with the moon shining over her head. In the dream, she came to an old cabin. Inside, there was a tall figure in an old uniform, his back turned, writing in a book. As he approached, the figure turned. It was Caleb. His eyes were completely white. "Now I patrol this forest," he said, without moving his lips. "They chose me." Julia woke up screaming, holding a coin in her hand. It was the same one Caleb had tossed on the bridge the first time. Engraved on the edge was a word. Stay. Chapter 3. The Guardian of the Way. Julia no longer knew what was real and what was not. It had been weeks since she had last seen Caleb. Since that night when the ranger appeared to her, the events in her life had become increasingly puzzling. The objects in her apartment kept moving on their own. Her reflection in the mirrors sometimes didn't match her movements. And the dreams. The dreams took her farther and farther away, to that same place she could no longer forget. Clinton Road. Every night he sat on the edge of his bed, watching the full moon through the window, waiting for the memories of the cabin, the tall figure, and the boot prints to disappear. But they didn't. Every night, the presence of the ranger, Caleb turned wraith, stalked her closer. It was then that he decided he had to go back. At first, she thought it might be a way to bring closure, to put an end to everything that had happened. Maybe if she went back into Clinton Road, she could find a way to free Caleb, or at least understand what had tied her to that place. The morning she made her decision, Julia plucked up her courage. She loaded a flashlight, water, and the old book she had found in the cabin into her backpack. She knew she shouldn't do it, but something inside her was pushing her to go. As if a voice whispered to her that the only way to get rid of the nightmare was to confront it face to face. The drive to Clinton Road was slow, the road empty and the lights of the city already fading into the horizon. By the time he arrived, a thick fog had descended on the road, enveloping the trees in a ghostly